I'm Vitaly. I was asked to tell you about interesting things about development, but this is a new track. I'd like to ask a question. Who are developers here? About a third. And who thinks that they are an architect? Handful of hands? Well, you're not going to be interested in this?
Не разработчики, но вам интересно по теме.
So if you're not a developer, but you're interested, okay, find you. And everybody else, you're just here because you have nowhere else to go. Fine. The most important thing to say is not about me putting together festivals and get-togethers and so on, but join anyway. I've been in development since 2008 for more than 15 years, and I've been working with petabyte systems with hundreds of databases working together since 2011. And as a consultant and as an in-house worker, I used to repair complex and high-load systems. And my presentation will be kind of related to Philip's presentation, but it will be a little bit more general. Who was present during today's first presentation? Okay. Please watch a recording if you have a chance. It's a great presentation, and I think I will add a couple of details to that. Let's talk about queues and brokers. I will call those MQs, and rabbits, Kafkas, there are a lot of standards. Postbits or Nazis, they can be used as MQs if you use plugins and so on. So there are a lot of ways, or you can write your own MQ yourself.
И я не так уж редко вижу просто собственную очередь, написанную со своим
In fact, I do see a lot of self-written queues, and they work more or less. But we will talk more about Kafkas and RabbitMQs. So Kafka is linear. We put linear messages and we read them linearly. So we have an offset, so it's a distributed linear log. It's not a queue. RabbitMQ, I'm not talking about MQ streams. It looks very much like a bad version of Kafka. RabbitMQ normally has very complex logic, how we put, how we retry, how we transform messages, and we have producers and consumers who know where to put messages and where to read them. So there are two standards in most systems, and we need to understand whether it is the first or the other. I'm not going to be objective, sorry. I don't have the objective to tell you that this is objectively bad or this objectively good. I will share my experience, what has worked and what has not worked for me. I will not tell you how to set up Kafka or how to get guarantees from rabbits and so on. Of course, I will not go into that.
Вот. Собственно, это будет снаружи, и в целом в этом, кажется, контента довольно много. Не будет узкой специфики, связанной с конкретными решениями. То есть, скорее,
I will not go into the narrow specifics. I cannot claim that I will talk about this the system in full, because that would take me about 10 hours. And of course, I will not go into this holy war between microservices and monoliths, because microservices are also services. They have the same relationship. So a service may consist of a lot of microservices, and it's not very important how do we split the services outside of each particular module or within a particular module. So it's not about microservices versus monoliths. It's about how we use code, is not how we implement code. There will be a lot of schemes and a lot of common sense. I'll start with an example.
Ну, собственно, когда мне позвали этот доклад делать, я просто пошел по знакомым, спросил, как бы, ребята, а вы нафига очереди используете?
Вот I surveyed my friends, middles, Junes, and I asked them how they used queues. And so these are my findings. The simplest way is I use MQs because I want a fast response. For example, when we do something big like create a user and or transferring money, and we need to respond to the user as quickly as possible. So first we respond, and then the transaction goes, and the transaction takes about 2 minutes. So everywhere where we want interactivity. So we put a command into an MQ. It will be processed in the backend, but we already notify the user that the MQ has got the message. Databus, very popular, especially among the beginners. So a message queue is called a databus instead of services talking directly to one another. Actually, Phil talked about databuses, where such a databus creates problems rather than solves problems. He has talked about guarantees, error management, and so on. Batch processing, when you have a lot of producers and there is a log. For example, a user has clicked on a banner or done something else, and there is a consumer who reads analytics in batches and puts this analytics somewhere else. Or an event log which sits somewhere and is read from time to time by a consumer. So for consumers, batching is much more important than for producers. So tasks and errors. So we want a command to be executed. But if a consumer is dead, or if there is a floating error, and so on, so you should retry until you find a live consumer, and the MQ actually gives you the guarantee that it will be retried. Maybe there will be 5 retries, maybe more, but actually the command will be executed. And of course, load distribution, when you have some hellish traffic, and we put all that into the MQ, and the consumer will find the time when there is no such traffic, and this all will be processed anyway. And of course, deferred processing. It's also, you need a command to be executed at noon. You put it into Rabbit, and at 12 o'clock, there should be a plugin, a scheduler, and so on. So more globally, we
Ну, то есть вместо того, чтобы
say
писать
that
большие полотна,
with
мы
MQs,
пишем маленькие
code and
тасты,
logic
которые вообще
are
не нужны.
simpler.
Вот. И это в
So
целом
small
упрощает
tasks
логику
talk
и уменьшает
better to one
связность
another.
внутри. Ну, то есть мы говорим о том,
And
что
there is less
не у нас куча сервисов
required
друг на друга смотрят,
consistency
а
within
мы
the
куда-то
service.
что-то
So
кладем,
it's not
вот,
a bunch of
ну,
services
то, что
looking
кладем, и
at
то, что
one
почитаем,
another,
никак не
but
связано. Вроде уменьшили связность.
we
Вот,
put
нас появляется какой-то контроль
certain things
запуска, то
in a
есть
certain place,
не,
and whether
у нас
people
прямой
read
вызов.
those certain things does
Условно,
depend on
продюсер вызвал
us.
консюмер, передал ему задачу, полетели. Вот. А консюмер может обрабатывать, не может обрабатывать, лежит, он не лежит, хватает ему ресурсов, не
So a
хватает. Ну, мы
producer
об этом не знаем.
needs to fulfill their
Мы это
task
не контролируем.
to
Вот. Если
give
мы
their
хотим это
output
контролировать,
to
очень
the
все эти
consumer.
какие-то
If
решения.
we want
Вот. Это
to
группировка задач, ну,
control
вот,
whether
условно, бэтчинг,
this
который мы
consumer
говорили,
is
бэтчинг на
processed,
входе, бэтчинг на
the
выходе.
cure may provide some a
Здесь
solution.
очень
We've talked
найдет
about
много
batching,
интересного
and here, of
в
course,
качестве
a
решения. То есть вот
cure
мы положили
is a
бэтчинг
very interesting solution. So, for example, we have a batch,
положили в очередь бэтчем сообщения, а дальше их там много воркеров обрабатывают с 10 машинок.
and there are a lot
Вот, или
of
наоборот,
workers
чтобы
processing
вот, ну, это какие-то гарантии доставки. То
processing the
есть
batch
того, что мы положили сообщение, ну и дальше оно
one by
доедет и
one.
доедет.
And
Вот, и в целом мы
there
можем
is a
доверять, что если
guarantee
мы
of
положили
delivery.
execute, то оно
It's
доедет.
like post. If you've
Вот.
posted a
Это если просто
letter,
высокоуровнево,
you
как
are
это понимается.
guaranteed that it will be delivered, but you don't know
Можно
when,
создать
but it will be
альтернативное
delivered.
решение.
Now, what are the
Что по
alternatives?
альтернативам? Можно банально вызвать команды. Ну,
So
вот
very
у вас есть
trivial.
сервис 1, сервис 2. Вот есть команды, которые
You have service 1, service 2 commands go through mesh queue, but why do we want a mesh queue
Как
if
думаете,
we
есть какие-то
can
отличия? Ну,
send
принципиальные с точки зрения
commands
разработчика.
between service 1 and service 2?
Вот
Do you
можно
see
поднять руку,
any
что с точки зрения
differences from the
разработчика здесь
developer's
есть
point
какая-то
of view?
разница с очередью?
Is there a difference
Есть.
between
А
actually
можешь?
using an MQ
Обработка ошибок. А на самом деле,
or a mesh?
да, именно.
Well,
Отличие только в обработке ошибок. Вот
errors,
магистральная логика не
yes,
отличается
this
ничем.
is
А
the
поскольку разработчик
difference.
чаще всего об ошибках не
But
думает,
this is the only
это ничем не
difference.
отличается.
And actually, developers
Вот.
don't think about
А на самом деле,
errors,
да.
and this is why there is no difference to them.
Масштабирование. С точки зрения масштабирования вообще ничем не отличается.
Scalability?
Ну,
No,
во-первых, ты
from the
заметишь себе
scalability
условно, или
standpoint,
запишешь в сервисе какой-то балансировщик.
you can write a balancer in the service, and that will be it.
Точно знать получателя. Вот. Вот, знание получателя — это большая
You
проблема.
know
То есть нам приходится
exactly
явно в каждом сервисе
who
задавать, а кому это нужно
gets
отправлять.
who
Какие у нас
gets
получатели,
the
кто
message.
живой, кто
So
не
every
живой.
message
Собственно,
actually
кто ну,
needs
вот эта логика должна быть
to
жестко зашита,
describe
это в,
who is the
продюсер.
consumer and whether the consumer is
Вот.
live and so on and so forth.
Что с этим
Actually,
делать?
the
Давайте мы магию
producer
сделаем.
needs
Давайте
to
мы скажем, что
get this
стучимся не в
logic.
конечный сервис, а в сервис mesh. И у нас,
Okay,
разумеется, всё
let's do the
поменялось.
magic.
Вот.
Service
Если
mesh.
Verone, то
And
вот эта
has
штука,
anything
это
changed?
конечный вывод Фила Дельгадо на тему того, как нужно строить микросервисы в финтехе. Вот.
So actually, this is what Phil
Просто
said
такая
how you
штука,
create
напрямую.
microservices
И
in
с точки
fintech.
зрения гарантии
You put it into
масштабирования,
mesh,
работы с
and
отказами и так далее, это
the
намного
mesh
удобнее.
is responsible for scalability, guarantees, and all
Собственно, дальше.
that stuff.
В целом, с точки зрения очередей, можем делать еще тупее. Можем вообще никуда не ходить. Прям внутри сервиса взять.
So you can
функцию.
create a function
И тогда очень
within
сильно хочется,
the
чтобы мы
service
ответили
itself.
быстрее, но вызвать
No
асинхронную
queues.
функцию. Там
Or you
просто какой-то
can
крутины,
call
случае
an
это
asynchronous
или
function if
типа.
you want a very, very rapid
Это можно
response.
делать просто вызовами, это можно делать через какие-нибудь очереди внутренние, это на самом деле не так принципиально. То есть в случае
Internal
очереди есть
queues
канал,
work just as well as external queues.
Вот. И вторая штука, которую можно делать,
The next thing
это вместо
can
того,
do
чтобы класть таску, которая обработает,
is without putting a task that is being processed, you can process it not when it was created, but
то есть, по сути, отложенный
when
исполнение.
you need the
Как это
data.
по сути?
It's a version of deferred
Это
execution.
тривиальный паттерн, просто посмотрите.
This is not
как
a
это
trivial
выглядит. Скажем,
pattern.
Мы создаем
Just look at how it
что-нибудь, не
might
знаю, создаем пользователя.
look at
Первый
how it
запрос,
might sound. So
мы создали
you
пользователя.
create a user. The put
Вот,
query
и
is new
создание
user,
пользователя,
create
сразу
new
создание
user.
пользователя, там десятки сервисов, там нужно создать ему профиль в
There are
сообщениях,
10
потом
services
аватарку
that
и
need
так
to be
далее, и так далее, там
changed.
десятки сервисов.
Avatar,
Вот. Ну, вот это
messages,
сделать мы,
chats, and so on and so forth.
ну, вот из некого роутера направляем сообщение о том, что вот нужно создать
And
аватарку.
from a certain
Вот,
router,
дальше пользователь
we
приходит в аватарку,
send to
получает
all
саму
those
аватарку,
services
ну, через очередь
the
сообщение, ну, и
message
об этом
that
храним.
something needs to be
Что мы с этим
changed.
делать?
Every
Мы просто
server
берем
responds, of course.
и создаем только пользователя в базе данных. Неважно, одна база данных или разная, это не так принципиально в данном случае.
And we
Вот.
create a new
Когда
user
приходит второй запрос
in
на
a
аватарку,
database. There may be
система
more
идет
than
в
one
базу, видит, что
databases.
аватарки нет, и просто
So
создает ее.
when actually the system goes for the avatar of this user into the database, it sees that there is no avatar for this user, and actually it creates. So this is a scheme that's logically the same, but it is much more stable. Just because, well, if we have enough resources, just because this thing always puts out consistent data. For external communication, you can use meshes or HTTP or gRPC, and you can write your own retry without or within your application. It is complicated, you need to program it, but there are a lot of such solutions already out there. Some other patterns. Put plus polling.
И когда-нибудь синхронно получили ответ. Мы можем то же самое делать через, собственно, положить задачу, плюс полить ответ, пока его не получим.
You can, for example, put a task and poll your query once every second or several seconds. It's not important how frequently you poll. So you put, you poll until you get the result. So service 2 may have its own queue, but we don't use our own queues. So Rabbit is often used like we put the message from service 1 into Rabbit, and then the response from service 2 also put into Rabbit. And this is a bad idea because you then try to write something new, and when something goes wrong, actually everything fails, everything fails if something goes wrong, everything fails. Service 1, service 2, and the queue. They can't fail separately. So why is there a problem? Because I've been describing to you some trivial things, yes? First of all, we don't know what the length of the task is when we put the message into the queue. So we put the message into a wrong queue, no one reads it, or we don't know what's going to be read. So this is a big problem. So in the best case scenario, it will be processed in an untimely way. For example, we want to create a user with all the avatars, and all the avatars will be activated only in a couple of hours, just because it was a queue.
Но глобально как это выглядит для пользователя чаще всего. Ну, то есть вот
And for a user,
одно это то, что просто сервис долго работает. Ну, то есть вот
this looks like this service is very slow. So we want to transfer money, and there is some polling, and there is a transfer going on, and the user just is not sure whether the money has actually come where I want them to. So on the one hand, the money is not on my account. On the other hand, I don't know where the money is on the target account. And actually, this happens pretty frequently.
У нас чаще случается повторная обработка по разным причинам. То есть, особенно если мы используем Kafka,
reprocessing happens more often than we think. So retries in Kafka are a very frequent thing. And when something happens wrong, and the user gets error 500. The root cause of the problem is, of course, much more difficult if we have actually done something wrong with the queue. We started to look at logs, service 1, service 2, service 3, and everything looks okay until we get into the queue. when services relate to one another in a concealed way through queues, sometimes it takes you days to find root cause. And this is my personal pain, that if you don't have an experienced thing, if you don't have an experienced team, right? This has not worked with this user. What have you done about this? Have you analyzed this? No, we just restarted the service and everything worked okay on another user. And of course, the tracking of your query is much more complicated with queues. There was only one service in which this tracking was done well, without actually me going and pinging the developers about that. For managers, of course, it's about the development taking longer time. The development itself is pretty quick, but there are bugs, there are tests, and so on and so forth, and the testers complain that it used to be simple, but now it's more complicated, and it's simple from the logic point of view. And if there is a problem with the testing, and if testing has failed and we have put it through, then there are problems in production. And the overall picture becomes much more rigid than it could use. We can't change the content of the tasks, the ways of communication, and actually the services become nailed together. We tried to create a flexible architecture when we introduce the queues, but in fact what we do, we make the architecture more rigid, because you have to stick in certain additional solutions for fail safety and so on, and all this makes the system much more rigid and much more expensive. So you have always to create additional entities. So we have changed the task, and before we only had a PC call. Now we have a queuer, we have workers, we have jobs which have to change with the change of the context of the task. And another big problem is that we don't see a visible logic comprehensively. So the logic comprises of a lot of tasks that are seemingly not related together. So the breakdown of this logic makes it much more difficult to deal with. So what are other problems for developers with the use of queuers? Well, additional processing, yes.
Да, дополнительные обработки появились, дополнительные коммуникации.
Yes, additional processing, additional communications.
А дальше используют готовый код. Ну, то есть это
So, for example, one developer has written it and everybody else just reuses their code, so what's the problem? Anything else?
Ну, то есть ты к тому, что это проблема скорее DevOps, чем разработки.
So it's a DevOps problem, not development problem? The comment is off the microphone.
То есть проблема доступа в продакшн.
So that's the problem of accessing production.
Нет, у тебя либо есть доступ к базам, либо нет.
Not a big difference. You either have access to databases or not.
То у тебя нет доступа, если есть доступ, то есть доступ. Обычно, больше того, с HR даже чуть попроще, потому что у тебя логи появляются.
And I think it's even simpler with queues, because the logic of accessing the database becomes clear to you.
На самом деле никаких проблем у разработчиков нет.
So in fact,
вот, и весь доклад посвящен только
developers don't have a problem. And actually this is the center point of the developers. These are problems of managers, of SRE, of the users, and so on. Developers like queues. Everything works, everything works. And this is the biggest problem why I need to make this presentation.
Давайте разберем просто глобально два больших сценария, как
Let's look at two big scenarios.
Очередями. Вот. Одна штука — это, по сути, взаимодействие между сервисами, находящимися далеко друг от друга. То есть это либо разные компании, либо разные команды.
Different companies or different teams produce services or an isolated service. So MQ works as a way of external communication.
Простая схемка выглядит примерно следующим образом. У нас есть
So this is how it looks.
второй большой сервис.
You have a big service 1, big service 2. They may be microservices or not microservices, not important. And there is a data cache, MQ, which gets tasks, receives tasks, and provides responses. This is just a universal recommended way of communication. The same problem as with bilateral communication. In fact, the services remain nailed together, but we have concealed it. You can do it this way. So message queue works only within service 2. We have put the task to service 2, and service 2 has responded to us. How they've done that? Through web polling and so on. Why is it a good thing?
Потому что это вот эта вот штука начинает происходить внутри одной команды, внутри одного сервиса и как бы ребята, которые есть. И в целом почти все доработки, которые происходят, они сильно более понятны. То есть и все интеграционные проблемы, которые ловились на этом кейсе, вот здесь просто не возникают. Ну, потому что HTTP в целом проще.
So all these problems do not actually happen with HTTP because HTTP is much simpler, and the guarantees we actually control all these guarantees on the side of the service, because one service gets the response from another service directly, and whether that other service uses the MQ is not a problem of service 1. So that's what I wanted to say.
Сервиса, причем
you can put the
больше того, это может быть неявное использование базы
Kafka or Rabbit or another MQ or any other unclear use of the database between your services. But in this form, it's much simpler to support. Now, if you still need external communication, this is where you can put an MQ.
Первая вещь, когда это полезно, когда у нас есть какой-то бродкаст. Причем в идеале,
if you do a broadcast with an unknown number of consumers, then an MQ works well. For example, a user has looked at something, or a user has shown up, and we don't know how many consumers there will be. Wildberries actually creates orders like that. So an order is put into an MQ, and there are a huge number of services reading it within Wildberries, and everybody can see any change in the order if they are subscribed to tracking changes. We don't have to register consumers. Those consumers can just come, present the reading rights, and they can read whatever has changed in a specific order. And it is not a substitution of direct communication.
Раньше это разного рода дата-инжиниринг, когда мы просто кладем ивент.
Data engineering also.
Бэчем кладем, бэчем обрабатываем.
So we can put and process events in batches. It's hard to do it in any other way. HTTP cannot actually
стриминги в целом к этому
transfer gigabytes of data in a string, and Kafka actually makes it much simpler than before. And internal communication.
Вот именно внутри сервиса. То есть вот когда это делает одна команда, когда это вот какой-то вот очень связанная между собой логика.
So when there is one team doing that,
20 лет назад было бы просто одним монолитом.
20 years ago it would be a monolith, but right now it's several teams doing, there are several pieces, and you never know whether your database actually works with the same entities.
Внутри нужна, когда нам нужен быстрый ответ, мне
Inside,
нужен быстрый ответ.
an MQ works when you don't want a very quick answer.
Контролируем. Плюс нам нужно очень тонко тюнить продюсеры и консюмеры, если мы хотим быструю обработку.
If we want a quick answer, you need to tune the producers and consumers whether you have an MQ or not. So direct call is much better. And if you want real time, for example,
мы это делали через очередь.
so a last activity of the user, for example, in one of my projects used to do through MQ, and it was not actually very useful to look at the past activity of the user in retrospect. We wanted to do it in real time. And the longer the cure, of course, the longer it takes. So here, you don't have a guarantee of timeliness from the MQ. And you have to stick in a lot of different crutches if you want to use the MQ. And
как бы мы надеемся, что это обработается. А когда обработается, обработается ли...
Well, if we don't exactly want a definite answer, then maybe you really want an MQ when your processing can happen wherever. But we want last activity to be seen now, not within 1 hour. Of course, direct calls, retries, and polling is better than a cure. If we want to actually put it in an analytics and generate a report, and if no one actually cares whether the report appears in 1 hour or 2, then you can use a cure. If you want real time, you can live with an MQ, but direct communication, direct streaming will be faster.
Если нам нужна явная
гарантия
команды и ее обработал.
Clear guarantee of execution.
Прямой вызов гораздо лучше, потому что в случае очереди
if the producer needs a clear guarantee,
продюсер это никак не контролирует.
Then you need a direct call. A producer does not have control of the queue. So if we have a direct call, if we have retried it, we have logged it, we have processed the response. For example, the response may be negative, but then you know what to do about it. So if it's critical to get a clear guarantee of execution, you need a direct call. But if it's not very important to you, but what is important is to make sure it is processed anyway, at any moment, a queue would be a good idea. Resources. If you have enough resources, I think you can live with a queue. And if you don't have enough resources, especially if you have spikes, a cure can really resolve the issue of spikes. So if something unprocessed just hangs in the queue, and it is much simpler, of course. But if you have enough resources, why do you need queues? Also, direct calls, they create a mess in the sequence, because you send one message, then you second the other message, then you retry the first message because you have not received a response, and so on. So if you need a sequence, an MQ can give you the guarantees of a definite sequence. HTTP cannot do that. And if your logic is fail fast, so if something doesn't work, you just generate error 500 and the user just reloads the page, right? So if you want to fail fast, direct calls work better. If you want to make sure that the user clicks transfer money and it is transferred maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, maybe when DevOps wake up on Monday and drink their coffee and finally resolve the issue. But if you want to guarantee that this will be processed at some point in the future, your MQ is your best friend. And if you have a single event log, so the user has done A, B, and C, and so on, and if you want to do something about this log, an MQ doesn't have an alternative. So you can create a database which will do that, but it will work as an MQ. When we talked about the work of architects, the overall problem is that the producer does something, and if we don't have this entity in a business logic, we don't have actually the same definition of task as the definition of this entity. When we do some state machines, for example, so we have a state of a transaction and we try to push it. We've created a transaction, we have pushed it into this, and in service tool we have created a debit, and this debit contains a command that we need to move to the next step, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on, until the command is over. And this is a very bad pattern, actually. Because de facto, when we call commands, we normally need a guarantee of consistency, not a guarantee that it will be processed at some point in the future. So when we actually create state machines like transfer money from here to there, or respond whether the money has been transferred successfully, we need to describe the entities. The entity will be processed by someone who understands what this entity is about. And it's not a fact that you can do this with an MQ. Resource-bound tasks. When you are restricted in resource, or may be restricted at some point, if you can use an MQ, use an MQ here. But here we know from the very beginning that your task will be processed, well, within an hour. Now, conclusions, how to use it.
Собственно, в целом антипаттерны того, что есть,
Anti-patterns,
с моей точки зрения, это просто общая шина данных.
of what I have seen, is like a data bus for a bunch of services. It doesn't work well. And actually, in 2024, we have good solutions for service mesh, and it works much better than data buses. If you need real-time delivery, when we don't trust the producer, when we don't trust the consumer, right?
Вот, тогда это осмысленно. Во всех остальных случаях
then I think it's a solution. In all other cases, real-time queue is a problem. Bilateral communication. Bilateral communication is actually through an MQ nails the two sides together. So if you have an option using retry, use retry. It's much simpler. If you can use cron, use cron. That's much simpler than that. And state machine commands actually being transferred through a queue, they are a problem. Of course, there are instances in which there is no alternative to an MQ. A log, actually a queue gives you an event log, what happened and when. If you need to break communication, for example, the producer and the consumer are in different perimeters, they may blink or they may shut down for a while. So if you want to break the communication
Или, скажем, они ту подружку даже не знают. Здесь
And or if they don't know about them,
к месту, и это, правда, тема отдельного доклада. Если у нас есть отложенные задачи,
you can use
которые нужно
a queue,
обрабатывать, скажем,
and that's a good use of the queue.
часик, через два, когда
If you
мы
have
вернемся.
deferred tasks and you don't mind them being processed within an hour or two, if you have a CPU-bound tasks, and again, if you work with the state machine as a state, not a command, so if everything is just interested in what was the state at a certain moment of time, okay.
Если хочется сервис воткнуть, очередь хочется воткнуть между сервисами,
Don't use MQs between services, but use MQs within services. That's the biggest takeaway from my presentation. And globally, when you make an architecture, look at alternatives. You can retry, you can break the tasks into several tasks. So look at alternatives and talk to those alternatives to everyone else. And it's important to say, what if there may be a breakdown in communication, the worker may shut down, the worker may wake up unexpectedly. And when you work with your architecture, you need to do a lot of what ifs. And you need to
Можем выкинуть очередь, заменить на крон, заменять. Можем выкинуть очередь, заменить еще на что-нибудь, заменять.
If you can drop the MQ and replace it with bilateral or with a cron, with a retry, do it. Степан Чернов, Сбер здоровья.
Сказал, что поддерживать межсервисное взаимодействие без очереди.
You've just said that it is easier and cheaper to support server-to-server communication without an MQ. But have you quantified this? From my experience, service mesh just adds 1.5 to a project. But that is just a one-time investment. No. I'm talking about admin and DevOps. I mean, an engineer supporting a service mesh is actually more expensive because there are a lot more Kafka engineers around. Yes, that's a great question. It's valid, and 5 years ago it was so. 3 years ago it was so. Now the solutions are more stable, there are more engineers, and the solutions are more portable. Kafka, you have to set up anew, but service mesh you can copy-paste.
Потенциально этот вопрос на самом деле холиварный, и я бы предложил
So potentially this is a holy war question.
обсудить, потому что я
So
понимаю,
you can discuss it offline. Okay, thank you for the question.
Здесь, пожалуйста, микрофончик, и потом микрофон вот сюда, молодому человеку. И поднимайте руки, чтобы я видел, куда потом отправить
Please raise your hands, because we have a lot of assistants with microphones. Dennis Kluyev, Positive Technologies. Any queue is comprised of messages, and messages have a certain length. I want to transfer money, or I want to send a message that I need to read something from the database. Does the MQ restrict the length of the message? MQs don't know how to work with large tasks, and you have to write up something specific like log files and so on. So Kafkas and Rabbits don't work with big tasks. So we, for example, can put a large task into S3 and a reference or link to that task into the message queue. But it doesn't work very well.
Спасибо за доклад. Меня зовут Руслан. Я строю процессинг.
I'm Ruslan, and I'm responsible for processing in Yandex
По
AdWords.
сути, передать ответственность за
So you
железо
want
и
to
СРЕ
shift
условно из,
responsibility
группы, которая
for
будет
hardware
администрировать
and
очереди, и она будет
SRE
одна на всю на всю
from
компанию,
the
в
group
каждый
that
сервис, потому
administers
что каждому
queues,
сервису надо
and
будет
it will
строить свои
be
логи,
one
свои
group
мониторинги
for the
поверх
entire company
какого-то
to the
своего
services,
взаимодействия.
and all the
Вот, и в
services
результате
will
мы
have to
получаем
do
по
their
SRE только
logging
в
and
каждой
monitoring and so
продуктовой
on.
команде,
And as a
вместо того,
result, we get
чтобы
an
сделать
SRE
одну
man
большую,
in
хорошую
each product team instead
команду
of
SRE,
making
которая будет
a
администрировать
one
очереди.
large SRE team for
платформа?
the entire company. And what about the observability of the platform? It's a great question.
Яндекс. Яндекс — это компания про not
I have
inventive.
worked for
То есть все
Yandex,
решения свои. И
and
решения для очереди,
Yandex
условно, ведь есть.
makes
И
its
работают,
own solutions. And
А решения для сервис Mesh
actually,
нормального нет.
you don't have a service mesh normal solution. No, you have a solution, but it's not
Нормальное решение
normal.
для сервис Mesh, все станет хорошо. То есть,
So when you create a normal solution for a service mesh, everything will be okay. I'm not shifting the responsibility to the developers. You can do that. It's not very scalable. But the point is that someone needs
Отличный
to
вопрос, на самом деле.
support
Можно
your
вот
service
на
mesh in a
эту тему
centralized way.
продолжить холивар. А сейчас
Yes,
просто ваш
that's
вопрос.
another holy war question. Your question, please.
Вот в контексте доклада мы рассматривали в основном монструозные очереди типа Kafka, Rabbit.
You have looked at like monstrous Kafka, Rabbit, and so on, but there are small queues like Java reporting queue.
Есть многие проблемы, про которые говорили, про глобальную
So
очередь,
a
они
lot
для
of
таких микроочередей,
problems
в принципе, не
that
характерны,
are
не решают очень
characteristic
хорошо эти
of
вопросы.
global queues, they are not very characteristics of the Java
Приложение
queues.
считаю тем, что внутри Java приложения пусть там живет и замечательно. Аналогично для Python
So-
приложения и так далее.
Но это тоже,
Okay,
тоже же
I'm
очереди.
not against of MQs within Java applications, but they are also MQs, and it really can solve a lot of problems.
Вопросы синхронных вызовов.
Смотри, там другие...
Synchronous calls, for example.
Ну, то есть
Well,
просто потому, что
there are
мы
a
не
lot of
предвещаем-
other issues, but they are
Проблема на самом деле
minor.
этого доклада в том, что ответственность от разработчика передается кому-то другому. В случае, когда ты используешь
So
очень
the problem is that developers shift responsibility on someone else. And this is why I decided to make the presentation. And this is why all the errors and all the communication breakdowns will be processed by someone else. And when the developer is not comfortable with it, they can correct it. But if there is someone else, like architects or admins or anyone else to deal with this, so the developer does not optimize the code, and the problem becomes bigger.
Ну, просто пойдет и
Right.
поправит, если что пошло.